Welcome to the final lecture of the social psychology class. This is focused on chapter 14, and it has a broader focus for me, and it's reflected in the social psychology IQ question there. It's my goal in teaching this course for students to not only learn a lot about social psychology, but perhaps most importantly, be able to recognize its many applications in everyday life. So I'm hoping that you can kind of not only integrate the material, but also integrate what you've learned about social psychology into appreciating and understanding your social world, possibly solving problems that you might face in your social world, and just making the course useful for you. So just a update, a reminder, this is also posted on the Blackboard site. I'm sorry, but I do recognize that the test initially was posted to be in the syllabus, available December 5th through the 12th, but because of my being behind on posting the lectures, I have going to try to post it possibly later tonight, the 7th, but most likely early December 8th, tomorrow, Monday, and have it one day extended to December 13th. So if people need some time on the weekend to do that, they'll have this Saturday. So for the chapter, we're going to just kind of review a little bit, very at a broad level, return to those major theoretical perspectives that are mentioned in the first chapter and also in chapter 14, look at the interrelationships between those perspectives, and just kind of take a peek at a broad level of what the future of social psychology might look like. So again, returning to a concept that we mentioned in the very first chapter, there is a distinction, but also a relationship between findings and theories. Different research findings make little sense considered in isolation from one another. Many different studies, they reach slightly different conclusions. But the important thing is that they can be brought together, synthesized into a theory. There are, of course, multiple theories. You've seen a lot of that, but the value of a theory is that it helps bring together all these findings into sort of more major or general conclusions. And the theoretical perspectives kind of help us think about theories within a particular area of social psychology and how they can help us understand from a different perspective. And it's also important to appreciate that each of these perspectives aren't necessarily incompatible, they just have different points of emphasis. Recall at the start of the course I told you also that research findings express average tendencies, or what is typical in the way that people respond to situations or personalities respond to situations. But there's always going to be individuals that are exceptions to that general trend. And this reminds us that people vary in their response to their environment, and that personality is a very important determinant of behavior also. So we often talk about interaction. Personality and situations interact to influence behavior. And again, we talked about that in the very early lectures of this course. I also taught you about how theories are formed on the basis of many consistent findings, but they're often revised as new evidence accumulates that suggests that there's some inconsistency that's regular or typical. So this leads to qualifications or revisions of the theory. So for example, we might say that frustration typically leads to aggression, but we might notice in some of our studies that found little aggression was related to, notice that some studies might find a little bit of aggression while others found extreme aggression, and closer examination of those studies might lead to a revision of the theory that says frustration leads to aggression, especially in certain kinds of contexts, such as when aggressive cues are present. Finally, looking over a lot of evidence about aggressive cues, we might learn that it makes more sense to take a broad theoretical perspective, something like social learning theory. Okay? So let's look at those major theoretical perspectives, stepping back a few steps. First, it's important to realize that some of them focus on what we might say is approximate explanation. This is a focus on relatively immediate causes of behavior. Another perspective on perspectives is that these perspectives may emphasize an ultimate explanation, a focus on background or historical causes. So theories may differ in the way that they explain behavior and what they emphasize. So some of them may be more proximate in their focus, and others may be more ultimate in their focus. So let's try to categorize some of these major theoretical perspectives that you were introduced to in Chapter 1 in terms of these kinds of considerations. So just a reminder, we have the social cultural theory, evolutionary theory, social learning theory, and social cognitive theory. The social cultural perspective focuses on the idea that what drives social behavior is the larger social forces, such as norms within cultural groups, social class differences, nationality and ethnicity, and how that might relate to cultural values and norms, or at a more kind of contemporary basis, fads and trends that might come and go in society. So social norms, you might remember, are the rules and explanations for appropriate social behavior. Appropriate reminds us that certain kinds of behaviors are encouraged and also certain other behaviors are discouraged. So when we talk about norms, we often are talking about an evaluation for good and bad, or norm consistent or norm inconsistent behavior. And you all had a personal experience of that, of course, when you did your deviance homework and you had an opportunity to come up against disapproval for inappropriate or non-normative behavior. When we talk about norms, we also have to remember that they come from a broader cultural context, the beliefs, customs, and habits, and even language shared by people living in a particular time and place. So, for example, in Chinese society, it's more tradition-oriented, it's more collectivist, it's more authority-oriented than North American society, but it's also has many points of similarity. I mean, they care and feel as though family's important, as do we. So we can consider both our cultural differences, but as well as our cultural similarities. You might remember, just to kind of give another example here, that when we were looking at pro-social behavior earlier in the semester, we looked at the social responsibility norm and how that influences helping behavior. We also saw that there were injunctive norms that vary across culture, and although all cultures are encouraging people to help one another, they may differ in how they help one another. So while norms and cultures are important, they do also tend to interact with our biology. So for example, in that same chapter on pro-social behavior, you may remember that Batson argued that we have an inborn capacity for empathy, and that's going to influence our behavior regardless of or in concert with the social responsibility norm that encourages us to help others. What about that evolutionary perspective? Interesting. Here we're talking about what drives social behavior, and the answer for this perspective are genetic predispositions that we've inherited from our ancestors. Some examples are the tendency to feel fear, unseen and angry face, the tendency to feel sort of tender and protective of children, particularly for mothers of those children. We also talked about mating preferences, and any of the behavioral tendencies that were assumed to have given our answers some sort of reproductive advantage, things that help us survive, avoiding danger, things that help us attract and retain a mate, and also those things that help us nurture and protect our offspring, defend territories, establish and maintain cooperative bonds with others, because we are so interdependent as a species that we rely on one another for survival. Those are all factors that we might expect to come from the evolutionary perspective on the genetic predispositions that we inherit because they were helpful to our ancestors. We also want to emphasize that we can see our commonality through many different social differences. Even though we have very apparently different social norms, say regarding marriage and friendship and other things like that, there are very striking similarities. And earlier, when we talked about aggression in the course, we noted that males overwhelmingly are the most aggressive, particularly with regards to lethal aggressiveness. We saw the common human capacity for empathy and prosocial behavior. Regardless of how that manifests in a culture, we see that as a common string among all cultures. We also note that even though it may take many different forms, and it may undergo changes like it is here in the United States and around the world, all human cultures have some form of marriage, some sort of cultural feature around the long-term bonding of two adults. And we also see that the attachment between a parent and child, even though it takes many different forms in terms of cultural practices, it is nonetheless a common feature of human society and our psychology, of course. So let's look at kind of a connection between these two broad ideas. So we have evolutionary factors, and these can kind of affect how cultures are designed, how they change. So, for example, our tendency to feel empathy for others and feel a cooperative impulse and a helpful impulse, that can affect things like the development of the social responsibility norm. Okay, so these human predispositions influence which cultural norms are likely to be adopted. So there we have the evolutionary factors playing a role in what sociocultural factors ultimately are part of cultures. And over the long term, sociocultural factors may in fact affect evolution in human groups because the social norms can influence the success of different survival and reproductive strategies. So here we have an interplay between evolutionary perspectives and factors and sociocultural perspectives and factors. Okay. Let's take a look at another one. Here we have the social learning perspective. According to these folks, what drives social behavior are the things that have been encouraged or discouraged either directly through classically conditioned kind of preferences, or perhaps the habits that are rewarded by other people, or in the true social learning perspective when we imitate the rewarded behavior of others, vicarious learning. We can link the social learning perspective, as we just did with the evolutionary and sociocultural perspective, we can link that to other perspectives. So it's a pretty obvious link, I hope, for you to see that the sociocultural norms come from years and years of social learning experiences. The learning follows tendencies laid down by evolutionary history, as we just made a point in the last. So, for example, people raised like family members in a kibbutz do not tend to fall in love, even though norms do not oppose it. So there you have a situation where they may not be related in a family sense at a biological level, but nonetheless the cultural features of that situation discourage that kind of interaction. The main point I want to emphasize, however, is that the social learning perspective is almost like that social learning process is like a mechanism by which each generation learns his or her cultural norms. The social cognitive perspective, of course, focuses on how we think about our social world, and that can include attention processes, interpretation and judgment about social situations, and also what we retrieve from memory and how we may influence our memory processes. So some examples of that from earlier studies in the semester is the use of simple heuristics or rule of thumb kinds of judgment strategies. Some examples of that might be that we tend to trust authorities without questioning too much. We tend to go with the majority opinion or majority behavior. And also that we tend to be persuaded by weak messages in some particular kinds of contexts. Not all of them, of course. Some contexts we tend to be persuaded by strong messages. Some examples of social cognitive research is, of course, the research on stereotypes that we talked about earlier in the course. And I also would just highlight for you, since it's an extra credit possibility on the final exam, in the Correll et al. Study, it's particularly relevant to current events. There is an analysis of how police may or may not be influenced by stereotypes when they make split-second judgments about the people who may or may not be holding a gun in the field. So I would encourage you to have a look at that material, kind of skim over it, your main conclusions, before you look at the final exam. So again, let's look diagrammatically at the connection between these two things. So we have social learning, which tends to affect the cognitive processes. So over time we are encouraged to hold certain perspectives, encouraged to think in certain ways. So our past experience with reward, for example, that encouragement or discouragement, affects the kinds of schemas, mental processes, cognitive structures, and attributions, explanations for the causes of behavior that we make. And that all, of course, feeds into social cognition. And the way that we think about our social world, what we attend to, what we think about, what we put into memory, of course, is going to affect our learning. So again, we have this nice interplay between these perspectives. So even though they're distinct perspectives, we need to think about how they interrelate with one another. We need to be able to distinguish them and recognize them, but also remember that they're not separate or incompatible viewpoints. So let's look at these perspectives in a little more detail. We'll look at each one and think about how they explain or understand a certain kind of perspective, a certain sort of social phenomenon. So we have these four perspectives on the left and a particular social phenomenon here on the right. So there are gender differences. We can all recognize that although we have, as a cultural value, the quality of sexes as a goal or as a value, nonetheless we do recognize that there are differences between men and women. So from an evolutionary perspective, we might say that those sex differences come from sex roles that naturally fall to one gender or another. So for example, if there are things that seem to favor for a female role parenting, well, that may be in part because biologically there's a stronger connection, a more direct connection through birth and breastfeeding than it is for men. Okay, so from a sociocultural perspective, we see that some social roles are more nurturing and they tend to be assigned to women. Of course, there's many men who are also nurses, but maybe there's a tendency for people to gravitate towards a nurturing profession that's consistent with those underlying biological differences. And these others, we've seen that men's testosterone, relating back to evolutionary things, tend to have them being more dominant, more aggressive, and so those social roles associated with those kinds of characteristics are both sociocultural but may have some origins in the evolutionary perspective as well. And then we look at the level of social learning. We see that boys may be discouraged for behaving in a nurturant way. That kind of discourages them later from filling social roles that are nurturing. And girls may be encouraged or rewarded for playing a more nurturant role. So again, we have this kind of interconnection. And finally, this social cognitive perspective is revealing that sometimes people will have a tendency to remember a man's behavior as aggressive and a woman's behavior as nurturant. So we have predispositions in our thinking patterns that help reinforce all of these things that we've been emphasizing. So let's think about these in terms of that distinction that we made earlier in our slideshow here about proximal and distal explanations. So think about proximal means the causes of behavior are most immediate, and distal means the causes of behavior are most removed in time, or more a background kind of thing. So if we were to arrange these perspectives from most proximal to most distal, this would probably make sense. Social cognitive, we're talking about in the here and now, how our thinking is affecting our immediate judgments and our immediate social reactions. So that's the most proximal explanation. Social learning is saying that our recent history with encouragement or discouragement in the course of our life has influenced us to behave in certain ways. Okay, so that's a little more proximal, but not quite as proximal as social cognitive. Sociocultural is more distal, okay, because here we're talking about societies developing norms over time, developing and refining social roles over time. It can occur in the space of a generation, or it can be a longer standing tradition. So it's something that is a little more distal in terms of its causes. And then, of course, the most distal perspective is the evolutionary perspective, because it's saying that the causes of our behavior are actually rooted in our evolutionary past, what worked for our ancestors many thousands, if not millions of years ago. So if we try to combine these different perspectives, there's a couple of general principles that help us link these perspectives, and we return to some of these concepts because some of them were mentioned, at least in part, in the first chapter. So remember that I said that social behavior is goal-oriented. It's not random. So it's important to remember that social behavior is goal-oriented. Also, we know that social behavior represents a continual interaction between the characteristics of the individual, the person, and the situational forces that are impinging upon him or her. Okay? So when we think about social behavior as goal-oriented, we can also think about a continuum from the very sort of immediate day-to-day goals that we might have to how they link to longer-term, broader goals. And those longer-term, broader goals that are kind of driving those more day-to-day behaviors are things like wanting to establish and maintain social ties. We want to understand ourselves and others so that we're better able to manage those social ties and predict how people are going to behave and be able to understand how we're going to react. We have the goal of gaining and maintaining status because that helps us in our social interactions. We also, when trouble arises, conflict arises, want to be able to defend ourselves, and we want to protect those people that we value because conflict is a reality in social life. And finally, but certainly not the least from an evolutionary perspective, we want to be able to attract and retain mates. Now, again, let's kind of link these different perspectives to a consideration of person and situation and how they might interact. Again, we have an arrangement here thinking about the proximal explanations to ultimate explanations. We have, and I'm sorry, in the last slide there, or 2 slides back, I said ultimate and distal because I was kind of linking that distinction with proximal and distal. So proximal explanations are those that are occurring in the here and now, most immediate influence. Distal or ultimate explanations are those that are occurring in the cause of behavior is far in the past, like the evolutionary perspective. And so we have from most proximal arranged up to most ultimate or most distal. Okay. So let's see here. We have evolutionary perspective says within the person we have both genetic predispositions that may vary by person but tend to be common, but then we have those broader things like human nature or capacity for empathy, for example. So we might have some genetic predispositions that vary from one individual to another or from one gender to another, but then we have broader characteristics like human nature. So an example of that is how features in the ancestral situation, in the ancestral environment linked to survival and reproduction is part of the situation that interacted with these characteristics that led us to have these kinds of things in the present influencing our behavior. From a social cultural perspective, we have internalized social standards. So even though it ultimately comes from society, within the person we have internalized those standards. So when you see that someone has dropped some money, for example, and you pick it up and offer it to them, that's not really the situation demanding of it. demanding that of you at that moment. It's because you've adopted and internalized those social values that leads you to want to help another person if they're going to lose something valuable. But they are linked to the broader social situation, which are the social norms that would encourage you to behave that way. And when we link down to here, the kind of rewards and punishments that you may have had growing up from your parents, from important peers, from other role models. So these social norms and cultural norms that vary by group or nation are part of what get internalized within the person, and the combination or the interaction of those two things are influencing your behavior. Social learning, of course, are when our habits and conditioned preferences become internalized and they're part of what we have carried around in us. But the situation is what offers the rewards and punishments that sustain or encourage or maintain those kinds of habits within the person. Finally, we have social cognition, where within the person we have schemas, stereotypes, memories, and all of these things influence how we respond to the situation, and the situation may have features that grab our attention, that cause us to engage these internalized features. So remember that we have a number of different ways, 6 different ways in which we talk about interaction. We have different persons responding differently to the same situation. We have situations choosing the person. Not everyone gets to enter every situation they would like. We also have persons choosing their situation, so these are exactly opposite of one another. So an example of the first thing, for example, might be that people tend to avoid threats, they take flight, or others are stimulated in the same situation to fight harder. So different people responding to threats differently. So that's an interaction. Some people will run away from a threatening situation, other people will respond defensively and fight. Okay, so that's different people responding differently to the same situation. For the second one, we have an example where sometimes people are chosen by the situation. For example, on an athletic team, a person might be chosen based on their skills and their capacities. Similarly, you might be accepted to one college but not another. And sometimes people are rejected by potential friends or dates. Other times they're accepted and pursued by potential friends and dates. Okay? And thirdly, people choose their situations. For example, the text showed us that research proves that, or supports the idea that violence-prone people tend to watch violent films, and less violent people choose not to. So let's look at some additional forms of person-situation interactions. We have different situations priming different parts of the person. When we talked about self-concept early in the course, we acknowledged that we can have very different parts of ourselves, and they don't always play out in every situation. Instead, situations can prime or bring into active conscious consideration different parts of the person, and they can then cause us to manifest or display or demonstrate that part of ourselves. We also have a situation where a person can interact with the situation by changing the situation. So certain people tend to change the chemistry or change the nature of a situation by virtue of their presence. And finally, we have the other way around, which is a fairly common way of thinking of things for social psychologists, that situations can change a person. So let's think of some examples for each of these types of interactions. Sometimes for this number 4 here, you might think of how when you're interacting with your professors, you may be more serious and thoughtful than when you're interacting with your friends on a weekend, maybe at a bar or at a casual event where you might be more silly and spontaneous. So different. That's still you in both situations, of course. You don't have multiple identities or multiple personalities, but you have different sides of yourself, and the situation can bring out those different sides of yourself. Number 5 here, we see that people can change the situation. The example that's shared in the book is the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. He transformed the whole FBI organization into a more powerful and more suspicious, more paranoid organization than it was before, just because he was such a dynamic and persuasive individual and he had such a strong perspective on what was a threat in the United States that he was able to change the whole organization, the whole situation of that organization. And also in your text is the example for number 6 here, how over time situations can actually change the characteristics of the people occupying those situations. So the Bennington College study, for example, showed that at the end of several years in a liberal college, students who arrived at that college as more politically conservative actually themselves became more liberal over the time that they spent at that liberal college. So the liberal situation took formerly conservative students and transformed them into more liberal students over time. That was the Bennington College study. Of course, there may be a conservative college out there that would have exactly the opposite effect. So what about the future of social psychology? Where are we going? We've had just a broad overview in this course. Social psychologists have only begun to understand how interactions between a person and situation contribute to a wide variety of behavior. We've looked at attachment and loving relationships. We've looked at charitable or helpful behavior. We've looked at racial prejudice. We looked at solutions to that to some extent. Interpersonal violence in families and in communities. Behavior in organizations. Conflicts between individuals and nations. Very broad kinds of topics, and there's certainly a lot that are not even on this list right now. Political behavior, work behavior, wide variety of things. I guess we've mentioned behavior in organizations there. So let's look at some further applications here. Lots of different areas: law, medicine, management, marketing, etc. For law, we might ask a question like, how does testimony from an unreliable eyewitness influence a jury's decision process? We saw that illustrated in the film that you were encouraged, if not required, to watch for this course. From the area of medicine, we might say, how does an intact marriage relationship influence the survival after a heart attack? Health psychology is an offshoot of social psychology. And for example, they know that social support is critical to the behavioral health and physical health outcomes of people after major medical crises. Management. Organizational psychology is, again, an application, a broad application, a specialization within social psychology. And we look at things like, how does a team leader promote creative problem solving and harmonious relations among team members? You also know about social loafing and social facilitation. These are questions that might be relevant to, or these are areas of theory and research that might be relevant to this sort of consideration. Marketing. How might a sales team best advertise or persuade people to learn about the new features of an energy-efficient automobile or buy tasty beer, as you might have written about in your last exam. Education. How can a teacher encourage children to make healthy attributions after failure? Attributions that might lead them to be more motivated to take up challenge in the future. And even engineering. We have a lot of engineering education going on here at UAA. How does a communication technology like cell phones, email, or Facebook affect social relationships? These are all relevant questions about how social psychology might apply to broad areas, diverse areas of application. So the future of social psychology. In exploring all these complex questions, social psychology are joining forces with other disciplines such as cognitive science and evolutionary psychology. Cognitive science, we connect to work in social cognition, research on the human brain, human problem solving, and artificial intelligence. Cognitive neurosciences, We're even starting to look at fMRIs and social information processing. Evolutionary psychology, which is a broad field and interacts with and integrates with many different areas of psychology. It's beginning to connect with experimental work on human behavior and working with anthropologists to think about other cultures and the biological research, even on other animal species. So, looking forward, understanding social behavior is really very important to solving many pressing problems. We have focused in the last couple of lectures on issues around overpopulation and the resource problems that are associated with that, aggression and crime. Right now in the United States, of course, we're very much focused on intergroup tensions and conflict. And as I've said at the start of this lecture, I'd like you to think about how you can apply social psychology to thinking about these kinds of problems, both at a day-to-day level and possibly even contributing in a scientific way at some later point in your education. So just kind of think here at the very end, you as an individual, you as a person who has integrated into yourself new knowledge and new understandings, can interact with the broader social context and think about how you've been shaped by your close social psychology class situation and how you may, in fact, go on to shape it, that is, shape the future of social psychology. So thank you for your participation in the course, and I hope you have learned a lot through this, and I hope that you continue to apply social psychology as you go forward. Thanks.